And then I'm going to pull up the presentation. And, oh, there's Lisa. Yay. We're all here. All right, from the beginning. I'm going to see if I can move my controls over and my pictures. All right, let me just see if I can get these over here, down here. All right, so welcome to our March Edgewater Wisdom School. We have Mark and Meg and Mary Ellen and Lisa, and we had on Sunday, we had Denise and Allison and Leslie. And Denise brought 2 of her vision boards. She brought the old one that she had done and a new one, and I didn't think to take pictures of them. So she'll get them posted. We have Meg's and Mary Ellen's and Jennifer's were posted, and an old one of Denise's. So we have lots of examples. And at the end, we'll look up close and personal. So I found a new quote to start. And the big question we're talking about tonight is what gets in the way. So this is a conversation I've been in for 40 years. As I was introduced to all of this work around manifestation in the early 1970s. And the part that gets really challenging is how come things don't manifest? So I'm doing all this visioning, I'm doing all my affirmations, and it isn't happening. So many of the authors that I've been a student of address this. But I just ran across this quote. I'm going to sail you with my new, I found a great book called The New Monasticism. I posted some of the articles about it. But he quotes one of my favorite thinkers and someone whose work I ran into in 1970, taking a course at Northeastern University in Oriental religion that was supposed to just be a gut course to fill my requirements for graduation. And it was in Oriental religion, but I wound up reading about a Jesuit, and that is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And his books, which were very hard for me to read because I didn't have the background to really understand philosophy or theology, but he had a profound vision of what we as humans need to do to kind of come together and transcend our lower way of operating. And that has stuck with me since 1970. And this quote I just ran across, which talks about kind of the goal of human life, what we're here trying to do. And he said, by his fidelity, which is that wonderful Latin word, he must build, starting with the most natural territory of his own self, a work, an opus, another great Latin word, into which something enters from all the elements of the earth. So we do talk about those 4 elements of earth, air, fire, and water. And he makes his own soul throughout all his earthly days. And at the same time, he collaborates in another work. And this other work is often referred to as the great work. In another opus which infinitely transcends, while at the same time narrowly determines the perspective of his individual achievement, the completing of the world. So basically, we are working within ourselves to perfect that vehicle for the soul. At the same time, we are doing work in the world to perfect the world. And the idea of perfecting the world means to bring in more light to the world, bring in, to release the divinity that's in the world. So the things that most everybody has said get in the way are conflicting beliefs. And in the book, we have a number of chapters where we get to examine those conflicting beliefs. Criticism, condemnation, and sarcasm. So this was a deep part of my own practice when I had to look long and hard at my speech. And it's a work in progress. It's a work I've been about for a lot of years. A lot of people don't realize that I don't use sarcasm. And it's funny how that happens is that people will think I'm saying something sarcastically or ironically. And the reason I don't use it is because of this spiritual practice. And also because I discovered my mouth should be a licensed weapon. And when I had done great injury to someone I loved and valued in the name of being funny and clever, and that was a long time ago, well, almost 40 years ago, that I realized I had to clean that up, that I just could not afford to use that clever wit that had been so finely honed when I was young. Resentment, a classic, resentire, to continue to relive the bitter feeling, the angry feeling. Resentment is a poison. Lack of forgiveness, and that can be forgiveness of self or others. Guilt, and then I think the one underneath that I can't see is unworthiness, a feeling of unworthiness. So those are the barriers that most people discover. Yes, Lisa. You're mute. Unmute.
Okay. So about the quote, can you say that that's framework 1 and framework 2? So.
Wonderful question. Just wonderful question. I think they're both framework 2.
No.
Ultimately, well, they're both, yes. I'm going to say yes to your question, because yes, as we do the work in framework 2 and it becomes manifest in framework 1.
Right.
So what we're doing behind the scenes, both in the world and on ourselves, is framework 2, and then it becomes the divine manifestation in the world. But great question. Thanks. All right, let's see if I can get the slides to go on. Once again, my controls are somewhere else. Okay, go back one. So this is what we're talking about always, is we're working on the lower vessel, and we're working to build a strong vessel in our mind, in our emotions, and our body, so that we can bring in the higher faculties, and all spiritual traditions talk about this. Some refer to higher mind as manas, higher intuition as buddhi, and then spiritual will as atma. But the whole purpose is, and there's a Kabbalistic teaching on this as well, about the vessel, creating a strong enough personality, which in spiritual traditions is referred to as the ego, not the false ego, but actually the healthy ego, to receive and hold this. So I always want to start our sessions by saying, this is the big work that we're about. This is the great work. So our question becomes, how do we create conscious, daily, moment-by-moment practice to identify limiting beliefs, behavior that contradicts our affirmations, fearful thinking, condemning, critical talk to self and others? So being ever mindful of these barriers to manifestation. So that's the larger context. So I have collected some of my favorites from, actually at the end of the document I sent you, I put the sources. These come largely from Emmett Fox and Catherine Ponder, two of the authors that I started reading very young, and two that have given me great comfort when I was pretty distressed. So this is one of my favorite ones, and it's the thing about when prayers don't get answered, and in some traditions we talk about there are 3 answers. God gives us 3 answers. Anybody know what the 3 answers are?
Yes, no, and wait.
Thank you, Mark. That's exactly it. And we'll talk about when wait is acting and why. So actually, God, being all-powerful, can do anything. And there's a whole practice that both Catherine Ponder and Emmett Fox talk about, which is praying until the 13th hour. So many times we think that the prayer, we've run out of time, we have a deadline, we haven't seen the manifestation, we haven't seen the answer, but we need to keep praying because it's never too late. And if we hold to the idea that there's always an answer even when we can't see it, then asking, do I really expect an answer to my prayer? Because I have to tell you, in the early years of doing this affirmative prayer work, I did not expect an answer because I had too many contradictory beliefs. So do you really expect what you pray for? And one of the ways to access that is some people talk about doing a 2-column exercise where in one column you write the affirmation and in the other column you write the rebuttal, what your mind actually says when He says, like, are you kidding? No way, never going to happen. What makes you think you'd be worthy of that? And so there's an exercise from the Seth book that we'll be working a little later about dialogue, and that's how you can use that. And you can use the non-dominant hand to write your answers, which is another great way to access what else is going on. So if you're not sure whether your prayer is being answered or not, it's better to pray for faith and release the problem to God. Pray for a divine solution and the right arrangement of your affairs. So Meg and I were talking about this the other day. You know, the thing that I was taught to say is, if this be your will, this or something better, or this or divine right solution. Just to leave it open, because one of the things that happens kind of early in this practice is we can start doing what's called outlining. I can get very specific about how I think it should be answered, and in so doing, limit kind of the brilliant solution that wants to unfold. Pray for the divine solution and right arrangement of your affairs, and then leave the details to God. If you feel you have not received an answer to your prayers, then pray for understanding. And I talk to the loving presence in a very literal way. One of my favorite prayers is to say, God, you know I'm really willful and really thick-headed. So I need you to make it very clear, because I don't get subtle. You know, I don't see subtle, I don't receive subtle, I just, you know, bulldoze my way on through. Now, that's a dangerous prayer in some ways, because as we say, you know, what does it take to get the lesson? You know, do you want to get it with a feather or with a freight train? And I'm kind of stubborn, so there have been some freight trains. Then the next thing is that when your prayers are not immediately answered, it's often because you've been trying to limit God's good in your life. So by specifically outlining and having a narrow solution in mind, that limits what God can do, or attempts to. Come on. This is one of those little things that, there we go. So this is one of my favorite things. I received great comfort when I read the spiritual tradition that said, it doesn't matter if I don't know what to pray for, because God knows what's in my heart and what's the highest desire of my heart, not just the surface limited one. So, you know, there's a lot of prayers that I'm grateful were never answered, because it was a limited selfish prayer. It was where I was developmentally, and they didn't get answered, and I'm really grateful. Since God always says yes, but to the highest desires of your heart, there's often much you need to do to make way for your prayers to be answered. So see in a little bit, there's often, that's the weight that Mark was talking about, because often much has to be made ready, not just in me and in my life, but in the great tapestry of life to which I'm connected and you're connected. So the prayer we actually want answered is the prayer of the whole person, spirit, soul, and body. You know, the one that will satisfy our whole being. And it may or may not be what you cry out for in a moment of pain or desire. That's the limited prayer. The only thing you have to be concerned about when you pray is that you grow big enough in consciousness to receive and maintain the answer to your prayers when it comes. So I would say that that's really what the spiritual journey is about, is, you know, continuing to expand that vessel to contain more and more, that lower triangle. So what's blocking the answer to your prayer? When it seems that your prayers are not being answered, it's usually because there's something blocking the answer. Some limited idea or negative emotion. Prayer has to work amazing results through you and for you. So that was one of the key concepts, is God can only do what he can do through me, you know, for me, because of the covenant we have around the permissive will of God, which is a complex thing that took me a long time to figure out. That's the whole thing about free will, is I have to give permission because of the permissive will. You know, when we set this up, God agreed to let us be free-willed creatures, and steps back, never leaves the universe, but steps back a little to allow us to have that free will. So often after we prayed, we've been inclined to snap our fingers and expect instant results. And often if we get an instant result in the prayer, it would not last because we could not hold on to it. That vessel could not hold on to it. So we would not have changed sufficiently to accept and retain the answer. So if you refuse to let prayer work in you, changing you deep within, then you stop prayer from working for you. So it's the inworking that happens before there's an outworking. And I have to tell you, just looking at the last 10 years, there's been a lot of inworking going on in my life. And I'm very aware of it. After praying, you must be ready to change and change and change. The change must be within your own thoughts and feeling nature, so you'll be big enough in consciousness to accept the answer for which you're praying, probably in a more expanded form than you had in mind. Many people who complain that their prayers have not been answered, let me go back, fall into certain mental and emotional patterns. They're the people who are too rigid in their outlook on life. That's me. I got to raise my hand. My own perfectionism and my own rigidity and my own idea of how things should be often have gotten in the way. So they need to mentally unbend and stretch. They're too set in their thinking, and they're not willing to change the inner so that God can change the outer. Does that make sense? Are we making sense?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So, what closes the door to answered prayer? Holding a grudge is like holding a hot coal. Emmett Fox has a beautiful writing about this, as he said, anger and resentment are like cinders. He was writing in the 19 teens and 20s, and they had, open fires and coal fires, and it's like a spark from the fire can land on your sleeve, and that's not your fault. But if you let it stay on your sleeve and burn through, then that's your responsibility. So holding a grudge is like holding onto a hot coal. It'll burn you again and again until you let it go. Fear, doubt, and worry will also close the door to answer prayer. So I know exactly what it's like to just finish my prayers and immediately pick up whatever I'm worried about, whatever I'm doubting, and kind of undo my prayer in that moment. Do you dwell on wrongs and mistreatment and carefully preserve them in your memory? You must have the courage to loose them and let them go. Using excuses, self-pity, blaming another for your problem all stands in the way of answered prayer. So we'll look at a prayer of forgiveness. Prayers of forgiveness from and toward those who have abused you or have persecuted you is the highest form of prayer, yet the hardest. And they're also the most rewarding and soul cleansing. So I have to tell you that this work has been some of the hardest work I've had to do. I hated my mother. By the time I was in my early 20s, I hated my mother. My mother had been very abusive to me in about all the ways you can abuse a human being, and I hated her. And I was introduced to these spiritual teachings, and I knew that at some point, for my own well-being, I was going to have to forgive her. And it seemed absolutely impossible. Like how could I ever do that? My rage at this woman, my hatred of this woman, my resentment. And it took a long time. It took 20 or 30 years. Well, maybe only 20. But was maybe not even 20 because the last time I saw her was 1986, and I was able to tell her I loved her and forgive her with compassion, and then choose not to have her in my life because she wasn't able to change the behavior. And if I let her stay in my life, I would have had to work on that resentment all the time. It would have just kept erupting. So the love of God simply cannot enter a bitter, hardened, unforgiving heart. And that was one of the mirrors I had in my mother, because my mother was bitter, hardened, and unforgiving. And prayers of forgiveness break down walls and barriers for your own good, often instantly, and so are well worth the soul effort they demand of you. Forgiveness is the secret formula for answered prayer. And in the handout with the affirmative prayers, I gave you a very specific exercise that I did for years, and still when I get back to that place, I use it again. It's the one that says, sit for a half hour quietly and bring to mind anyone you might have a resentment about, and go through the forgiveness practice. So that is that prayer. So here's one of my little posters I made. This I actually made for my older half-sister. And I sent it to her with her name on it. And there's two parts to it. because we had a lot of woundedness in our family. And the affirmation that you say, even though the prayer of forgiveness through gritted teeth, is, bless you, for the grace of God working within you and through you. I freely and fully forgive you. I loose you and let you go. And then you say, you freely and fully forgive me, and you loose me and let me go. All is now resolved between us. So this is a prayer that I have used on and off for 40 years, and it is incredibly powerful. And because the whole understanding spiritually is we bind people to us with resentment. So you know those people who keep showing up in our lives that we wish wouldn't show up in our lives? They're bound to us through resentment. So until we clear the resentment, they're not going to go away. So we bless them in peace and release them. So if you have a problem, you have something to forgive. Anyone who experiences pain has a need to forgive. Anyone who finds themselves in debt has a need to forgive. Wherever there's suffering, unhappiness, this is from Emmett Fox. Lack, confusion, or misery of any sort, there's a need to forgive. When your own good is delayed, that's the time to forgive. Often everything stands still and there's a deadlock until forgiveness is released into the situation by you. Forgiveness can sweep aside all that has delayed your race toward good. And this one is really powerful, and I've used this in job situations, family situations, personal situations. If only one person will dare to forgive, doesn't have to take everyone, just one person, the problems can be resolved regardless of who else is involved and whether anyone else wants to forgive. The person who dares to forgive gains control of the situation. He may not appear to have any prior power to solve the problem, but suddenly there will be a change. I've done this in very difficult work situations and been astounded by what happened. The person who forgives will find a divine solution appearing. The forgiving state of mind is a magnetic power for attracting good. Nothing good can be withheld from the forgiving state of mind. This one is sweet. It is easier to forgive those you're inclined to condemn, resent, or hate when you remember this. And this is one I used with my mother. They have not failed nor disappointed you. They have not even let you down. They may have stumbled while crossing your pathway, but in reality, they are sons and daughters of God who temporarily lost their way. This is the path of compassion. If they crossed your pathway, it was because they needed and wanted your blessing. So bless them and they'll go on. They were unconsciously looking to you to be steadied and set right. Your progress has not been hindered no matter what they did. They cannot keep your own good from you. They crossed your pathway by divine appointment, even though they seemed to hurt you for a while. So Mary Ellen, all those people who were calling you last month with that wrong number, when people bother you in any way, it's because their souls are trying to get your divine attention and your blessing. Give them that and they will no longer bother you as they fade out of your life and find their good elsewhere. Meanwhile, divine restoration will take place in your affairs. How's that been going?
Actually, they've been tapering off.
Good. All right. So we will, yes, it works. Although we have often, this is the power of release, sometimes, so some of us have what Scott Peck calls a letting go neurosis. Letting go neurosis happens with some of, okay, Mark, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to go, but I've really enjoyed this. This is terrific.
Well, super. Well, you'll be able to listen to the recording.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Meg, are you going to stay on?
Yep.
Okay. All right, super. Thank you, Green Lantern.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So Pamela, while you're paused on forgiveness,
Sure.
somebody said to me, like, you know, oh, Lisa, your path to enlightenment, you'll be closer when you forgive Donald Trump. And I just started laughing.
well, actually, it is important that we bless and release him.
Yes.
It really is important that we bless and release him.
It is totally true.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's think about that in the power of release.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why we actually had quite an intense conversation on Sunday. Allison brought it up about, you know, how do we hold these conversations that are going on in the world today? And, you know, and I talked about my practice is to not get in them. because I do not want to fuel them with my attention. It's really because of these spiritual principles. It doesn't mean that I'm judging them or wanting to shut them down. It's just that I have a healthy appreciation of how toxic they are for me
Yes.
and how hard it is for me to stay in my right mind with them. So yeah, that's great. So, you know, although we often have intense emotional attachments, this letting go neurosis that Scott Peck talked about was wonderful. I read this in the 80s, and he said, some of us lost too much too young. And because we lost too much too young, we have difficulty because we hold life with such a tight grasp that we cannot let go of anything, even when it's clearly lived beyond its purpose or is harmful to us. So that fear of emptiness is so great. So, you know, and this is where we can get into that bondage. So although we've often thought of intense emotional attachments as one of the highest forms of love, quite the opposite is true. None of us have children, but often this is what happens with people and their children, is they get a form of possessiveness, and it leads to bondage. Whereas the way to true love is to free what we love in the knowledge that then the way opens for a more satisfying love to develop. Do you remember that old thing about love is like a butterfly, let it go and it'll come back to you and all that? That's really the spiritual principle that they were talking about. And if it's meant to be, yeah. One never loses anything worth having through release. You know, the spiritual principle is that we hold on to things through divine right of consciousness. If I have the consciousness for something, it's going to be attracted to me and it will be with me. If I don't have the consciousness for it, then I'm not going to be able to hold on to it whether I have a death grip or not. If through strong emotional ties you direct the substance of your thoughts and feelings into someone else's life, and I'm a world-class rescuer and fixer, so this is an area that I've really had to work on a lot to make sure that I am not putting everything into somebody else's life that should be in my own. And I've often paid for it with ill health, you know, that my energy all went outward. Your problems do not create themselves. You create them through your own fearful thinking. Through speaking words of release, these problems are then freed to work out in whatever ways are best. When you want to be free from ill health and liberated from other problems, you should speak words of release both for yourself and others. So once again, bless you, I loose you and let you go, I release you to your highest good. Criticism and condemnation. So this is when we started talking about the Trump conversation, is I really need to stay out of those conversations because it's an invitation to participate in behaviors that are going to have some pretty negative spiritual. The more you evolve spiritually, the quicker you get a consequence of doing things. So the thoughts that most frequently work ill to you and stop your prayers from being answered are thoughts of criticism and condemnation. If you're criticizing or condemning anyone, you're keeping your own prayers from being answered. Where there should be an open channel in your thinking, there's a big grudge blocking your way to good. So a lot of social conversations that people invite us to take the form of ain't it awful? Ain't it awful? And we all complain about things, whether it's the weather, the economy, the politics, whatever. And that actually is quite limiting spiritually. So one of the finest ways you can invoke the healing law of denial, which is one of Catherine Ponder's laws, is to keep quiet about your problems. Stop feeding them the substance of your thoughts, words, and emotions. So this is another place that people can invite us, you know, out of caring. They say, oh, did you find a job yet? You know, how's your bad knee? Is it okay? And what they're doing is inviting us into that conversation about our own limitations. So stop feeding them the substance of your thoughts, words, and emotions. Also watch that you do not criticize secretly. So that's the interior dialogue. I was raised by people who, when they drove, they criticized all the drivers on the road. So that's one of those just channels that plays. Fortunately, I've gotten it to go silent in my head. Put away sarcasm from your speech. Stop complaining. Do not prophesy evil for yourself or another. Oh, they're going to get in trouble there. Oh, that's going to be bad. Cease from petty statements about yourself and others. Some of the most critical talk I've heard is self-talk. When I teach in studio classes, I listen to awful, awful things that people are saying about themselves. I have no artistic ability, I'm stupid, I suck, just awful things. And it became a joke that people would say, well, when you take a class with Pamela, you're not going to be allowed to say those things, just because it created such a toxic environment. And I would say things like, I really like the person you're talking about, so I wish you'd stop saying that. All right, right speech. And this is the conversation about today. What do we need to be really mindful of is right speech. So you must be careful what you notice, talk about, or give your attention to, because that is what you are inviting into your life. Whatever you notice, you're inviting into your life. So that's the whole gratitude practice. That's, the practice I've done around today's beauty. Today's beauty is an antidote. So if I look for beauty and actively see beauty, then I'm inviting more beauty into my life. As it's a form of mindfulness, a spiritual practice. Whatever you talk about, you're inviting into your life. Whatever you identify within your thoughts, words, and actions, you're inviting into your life. So if you notice, talk about, or identify with war, crime, disease, financial problems, inharmony, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, this is what you are inviting into your own life. So it doesn't mean we cannot be concerned. It means we need to have right speech. Open your mind to receive by telling God what you want instead of constantly telling people. So part of my prayer is also what I want in the world. How I would want the world to be. And part of my prayer right now is I want the world to be more aware of the divine presence in each other and in all living things. So that's a way for me to affirm the vision of what I would like to have in the world. Telling people what you want can dissipate your own good, because God is the source of your supply, not people. Now, for those of you who are starting your own business, this is I had a conversation with somebody else today. It can get tricky because people will unknowingly give you their fear and add to yours. Although people, ideas, and opportunities are all channels of supply, God is the source because he creates those ideas and opportunities. Through the law of mind action, he helps attract the appropriate people and circumstances to you to help expedite those ideas and opportunities which your good can come to pass. So that's the whole thing about visioning and claiming. So somebody asked me today, well, what about all those courses on how to build a business and, how to get clients and how to do all that? I say, they make me so anxious. I can't even be in the conversation or read the blog. It makes me so anxious. And, I've been self-employed for 40 years, and that is not what I did. These spiritual practices are what I did. I visioned it, I affirmed it, I cleaned up my speech, I cleaned up my thinking, and it manifested, and it has continued to manifest. So, some people have seen this before. I know you can't read it on this screen, so it's part of your handout. And this is part of many spiritual teachings, and it's the same thing about, this whole practice around, right view means how am I looking at things? Right thought, what are the thoughts that I'm holding about things? Right speech, right action, right livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. Just in the previous ones we said, what we get is what we think about all day long. You get what you expect, and so that's right concentration. All right, ready to dive into the book? Or anybody have things they want to say? We're just cranking along, and I talk really fast, so. Somebody say something so I don't feel so monopolistic.
I'm ready to dive.
What?
I said I'm ready to dive into the book.
All right, guilt and grace. Guilt and grace. So Seth has a wonderful teaching on the natural purpose of guilt. So in some of his books, mainly The Nature of Personal Reality, he tells the story of how we came to be at this stage of development. So in, and there are many, all the traditions of the world, esoteric traditions, have the same story about the many levels of development. And there was a time that we were more telepathic and more in touch with nature directly. And with some of our myths and fables still carry the memory of what it was like when we had like centaurs, who are half man and half horse or stag, and other kinds of creatures, the nature spirits and all that. Well, that was when we were in touch directly with nature and directly with each other. As part of this great experiment of free will and consciousness, the intention was for us to become kind of rational beings and focus on our mental development. And in so doing, we lost our attunement to nature. So when we were telepathically connected to all living things, through what some people talk about the etheric body, we had a natural system that prevented us from doing harm. You know, if you're telepathically connected to other creatures, you cannot do harm without harming yourself. You cannot inflict pain without receiving the pain yourself. So we needed to have a different mechanism, which is guilt. So guilt was supposed to replace that kind of natural sense, and it was supposed to give us a momentary pause. So when we did something that caused injury, we needed to feel that injury consciously, reflect on it, and then choose to not repeat the action. At some point, that became overdeveloped. So its original purpose was to enable you to empathize on an aware level, a conscious level, with yourselves and other members of creaturehood, so you could consciously control what was handled on a biological level alone. That's what it means. Guilt in that respect, therefore, has a strong natural basis, and where it is perverted, misused, or misunderstood, it has that great terrifying energy of any runaway basic phenomenon. So what we have now is actually an abnormal guilt. What most people feel guilty for, guilt is just meant to be something that causes me to stop, examine my conduct, and change. When I carry guilt for the whole human race, or I carry guilt for the whole world, or when I feel guilty for wanting something, or wanting to manifest my heart's desire, that's abnormal guilt. So as you look at that chapter, what came up for you? It's chapter 11.
But I have to say I am behind in my reading.
Oh. So that's why you wanted to dive into the book. Okay.
But I really love that concept of guilt as the pause.
Yep.
Instead of the suitcase that I'm carrying with me the rest of my life.
Yeah, it just doesn't. So he talks about guilt arose as a necessary substitute for animal instincts that man lost as he evolved into a new state of consciousness. But then let me get the next statement, which I just love, which is about grace. Seth just talks about grace in the most exquisite way. Is the state of grace is a condition in which all growth is effortless, a transparent, joyful acquiescence that is the ground requirement of all existence. Your own body grows naturally and easily from the time of birth, not expecting resistance, but taking its miraculous unfolding for granted, using all of itself with great, gracious, creatively aggressive abandon. Isn't that a wonderful vision? You are born into a state of grace, therefore it is impossible for you to leave it. You will die in a state of grace, whether or not special words are spoken for you, and somebody else is going to have to read it because I can't see it.
I could.
Yep.
Or water or oil is poured on your head. You share this blessing with the animals and all other things. You cannot fall out of grace, nor can it be taken from you.
Isn't that a wonderful sense? You cannot fall out of grace, nor can it be taken from you. There is nothing I could do to be removed from grace. So coming to understand grace was one of the most freeing things for me, and how I came to understand it was through the Seth teaching. Is I pushed away so much of my good because of this feeling of unworthiness. You know, I had the bad seed unworthiness stuff. And I wrestled with this stuff and wrestled with this stuff. And somewhere in the middle of a night, of wrestling, I realized that grace was a free gift to all creatures. And that it was the height of grandiosity for me to think that I could be outside of grace. That, I could decide that I was unworthy when the loving presence had already decided that we all have grace. So what I was basically saying is I know better than God. I know more than God. And that really worked for me to recognize that grace is a free gift. Right?
Well, I have to say,
Yes, Meg, please.
oh, I just remember one of the very first times I think you and I spoke on the phone, you shared that concept with me, and I think I'm still months and months and months later still working on internalizing that. But I love that, what you just read.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a long time for it to have full resonance. But it just changes things. Lisa, you got a face. What?
Yeah, did you read The Art of Empathy?
I've read quite a bit of it, yes.
Yeah, so well, The World According to Her, which is, that there's guilt is really a state. You're either guilty or you're not, and
Right.
it's really shame.
Exactly.
And so there's so much shame in the world because, basically her advice to parents are whenever it becomes alive in your child and you know that it's alive, there's no need for you to add it. There's no need for you to shame your child. But, growing up or whatnot, like parents, shame their kids and not even realizing whether that shame, that feeling is alive in them or not at the time that they're doing it.
So one of the teachings I do with my clients is about the shame-based system we've all grown up in. So I teach around, I'd be happy to send this, Lisa, because I know it's work you'd be interested in, shame-based versus respect-based.
Right.
And what it looks like. And this comes from the work of Marilyn Fosson. And so in the 80s, Scott Peck and John Bradshaw really brought to the world a body of work done by Nathan somebody, I can see the book on my shelf, I'll have to look what it is, who was, it was very clinical and it was a slim little volume, but not popularized. But John Bradshaw popularized it around toxic family shame. So, guilt is simply something I've done that I'm guilty for, and I can take action and correct that. Shame is around my whole being and my whole worthiness. And I, like many who grew up in a dysfunctional home, had toxic shame. I had generational shame. I had my mother's shame. I had my grandmother's shame. I had it on both sides of the family. And so the burden of shame I was carrying was huge. And then I had my own personal shame for things that I had done that I thought took me outside of the moral structure, which today I understand is I just needed to have guilt, not shame. And, shame is societal. Shame is about our worthiness and our whole self. Guilt is about our actions. So the shame-based system, which we grew up in schools and families, is based on the premise that people are supposed to be perfect. Mm-hmm. And because people are supposed to be perfect, you cannot make a mistake. And if you make a mistake, you are bad and unworthy for all time. There's no repair. You're just now bad and unworthy, and therefore you are outcast. So that's the shame-based system, and schools ran with it, homes ran with it, businesses ran with it. The respect-based system, and this is Marilyn's work, Marilyn Fosson's work, starts with a different premise. And the premise is people are imperfect. Because people are imperfect, they will make mistakes. People need to be accountable for mistakes. So it's not just a laissez-faire license to do whatever you want. No, people need three things. They need to be held accountable for the mistake. They need to be given an opportunity for repair. Most of us came up in systems that we were not given an opportunity for repair. And the relationship needs to be reinstated, repaired and reinstated. Because if I disappoint you, or if I let you down, or I in some way fail you, there is damage to the relationship. And so I need to fix the thing I did and heal the relationship. But here's the key. Never is the person's worth in question. And there are books about parenting, you know, shame-free parenting now that are coming out, and it's really about not putting the worth on the line. It's about actions, you know, and some of you've heard some of this where, you know, I'm not mad at you, I'm mad at your behavior. You know, I'm not unhappy with you, I'm unhappy with your behavior. So that's where some of that started coming from. But yes, that is the deep root of the difference between shame and guilt. Guilt is an action that I did that I need to be responsible for, and guilt is the mechanism that keeps me from repeating those things. If, you know, in the 12-step programs, we have amends, and amends are where we have the opportunity for repair. So in our moral inventory, we look at the places where we have harmed others and failed them and disappointed and let them down, and that's where we clean up guilt. So we clean up guilt, and we clean it up by making amends. After that amends is made, there should be no residue of guilt. If there is, then it's actually shame and old unworthiness. So if I've cleaned it up, then I need to let it go, and I don't get to decide that I am not worthy. You know, I've made the amend, and now it's in God's hands. Now, were there people who were unable to accept my amend? Yes. And I think one of the consequences of moral development as a human is I have to live with that as a consequence. That there were some people that I injured in ways they were not able to forgive. And that helps me with my willfulness, because it's really good to have that as a memory. And, you know, most of it was when I was very young, but, you know, it is a consequence. Other thoughts? Yeah, this is a really great area.
It is, and I feel badly because I have to
Go to a
get off
coach in 8 minutes.
and do my certification call.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be listening to the recording, so just say a lot.
Okay, we will. We will. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, thank you, Lisa and Meg, for that conversation around guilt and shame and worthiness and grace. Because that's, you know, we really can only manifest what we can allow ourselves to have. And if we're still stuck in shame and unworthiness, we can't allow ourselves to have very much. And I know that a lot of my life, I realized I was doing penance. You know, I had a tendency to be wasn't self-sacrificing, but it's like some of the stories I've told about. I wouldn't give myself permission to do what I could do. Like I had the time and money to go on a vacation, but I wouldn't let myself go on a vacation because somehow I didn't think I was worth it. You know, that is that guilt that is not really appropriate. It's like, well, you know, my friends can't go on vacation and my siblings can't go on vacation. So, you know, and this is what some people call survivor guilt, that makes it hard to thrive if we have other people in our lives that aren't thriving, and holding myself back because others aren't thriving. So, yeah. Chapter 12. This one might be a little hard to get your head around at first because there's much in the Seth work about it. It's about, and in the Eastern teachings, they talk about it too. It's called duality, that we see things split in half. So if you go all the way up and say there is only all that is, you know, that fundamentally there's only God, then everything exists within God, and that means it's one. So then we can't have opposites. But once again, in this reality, we set things up so that we could learn and we could co-create this reality. So opposites appear as conditions of existence. So because we're trying to learn how to handle certain kinds of energy and to be conscious co-creators with all that is. So one of the things that we do in this stage of development is separate things out so we can see them. So there's self and other. At some level, you and I are not really separate, but it works a lot better if I can say this is self and this is other, because then I can look at it differently. Good and evil, one of the biggest things that I wrestled with is the fact that there is only God, so there actually can't be evil that is separate from God. And that's like a huge concept that I don't know that I can really get language around yet. But, if we talk about kind of what's going on in the world now in the second paragraph, in your terms, the ideals of good and evil help you recognize the sacredness of existence and the responsibility of consciousness. So sometimes we have to do this as a drama where we have good guys and bad guys so that we can consciously choose. This is what the Greek plays were about. We've been doing this kind of drama throughout the history of humankind. And so we have to have a hero, and we have to have a villain, and we have to have, kind of moral principles and, the force of good. And so right now we're playing it out at a societal level. And if we can step back and say, in the medieval times, they had what are called passion plays. I don't know if anybody's heard about passion plays, but they were used to teach moral truths. So, they would perform these because people didn't have books and people didn't have, video and they didn't have sitcoms and other dramas. So, right now, a lot of people are watching This Is Us. I don't know if you've seen this series called This Is Us. It actually is a modern morality play. And I think that's why it's capturing so many people's attentions, because it's about all these dramas of life, all these, what is good, what is evil, what is moral, what is, and there's a lot of people wrestling through choices that are very real. So, part of the ideas of opposites are necessary guidelines for the developing ego. That ego is that lower triangle. So as we try to get a clear sense of, what do we feel, what do we think, what is our orientation to reality, that's what we play with. We play with opposites. The Jungians call this the tension of the opposites, is that we often hold things in tension so that they can be seen more clearly. That's about all I can say about that chapter.
Is it like what's coming up for me is like Brene Brown, right?
Okay.
She said, hey, I think it was her, when we look at the world like black and white, good or bad, right or wrong, because if you're not right, then you must be wrong.
Yes.
And so like looking in the world in that black and white, there's the movie 3:10 to Yuma, I think says this. Have you seen it?
No. 3:10 to Yuma? Okay.
3:10 to Yuma. It's really this guy played by Russell Crowe is supposed to be this really evil guy, and he can do some good stuff. And then Christian Bale is supposed to be this really good guy who really can do some bad stuff.
Okay.
And so, like, are you really one or the other, or is the world really that black and white? It really kind of depends on where you sit and what your, perspective is.
That
and really,
perspective taking.
what do you to say to put a value judgment on that?
Great, thank you. Meg?
I guess I'll ask you wise women, your perspective on what comes into my mind with this chapter is the dialectical, I guess, or whatever, between darkness and light, and then like sickness versus health, and somewhere there's a balance, or I don't know if you have any speak to that. I guess maybe sickness versus health and that dialectic, or we can.
Oh, Meg, that's great.
Yeah.
You just triggered something for me. So one of the things that my spiritual advisor has worked with me for years on is the fact that I want to split apart the opposites. I only want to have health. I only want to have good. So that a lot of my experience, particularly around my energy ebbs and flows. That I have probably always had a natural cycle of ebbing and flowing energy. You know, who knows? It may be a moon cycle. It may be, you know, some other larger astrological thing. I don't know. But the reality is my energy ebbs and flows. Right now, I'm in low energy. It's been a new moon. I think I was in real low energy on the new moon. I don't know what it is. But see, I only want one of those to be true. And so that's what I think you're talking about here, is that dialectic tension is the way we have set up this world. And when I want to drop out one of the two poles in this tension, then I no longer have the dynamic reality.
Thank you.
And I think what Lisa is saying is, you know, I can only know good in the context of evil. I can only know it. And so in the dialectic, everything's relative. You know, the goodness is relative to the evil, and the evil is relative to the goodness. And at some point, they actually shift. And then I realize that they are one energy with two poles.
Thank you. Thanks.
You know, it's the dance. The Jungians talk a lot about the tension of the opposites as part of a dance, and that part of the work that we do is try to get them really clear so that we understand the polarity that we're working with.
Thanks.
Well, thank you for asking. That really helped frame it. All right. Dialogue. This one is where I was talking about the 2-column exercise. So she talks about doing dialogue with the part, you know, so this is me writing. A technique for inner dialogue with part selves, as it is sometimes called in therapeutic work, is a great way to discover inner conflicts that are getting in the way of manifesting what you say you want. The key is to make sure everyone has a voice. You know, all those people that dwell in us have a voice, and they get heard. So I had a text from somebody that I know from adult children of dysfunctional family 12-step program. And she wrote me from her 5-year-old, her inner 5-year-old sent me a text today. And she wanted to know about my inner 5-year-old. And that was kind of an interesting question, because I realized I haven't had much dialogue. There was a time that I was much more aware of that young part of myself, and that maybe when spring comes, I'll let her go out and play again, because I don't think she's been out for much of the winter. And so, you know, consciously being able to access those parts of us, and making sure that everyone gets heard. So if I have some affirmations that I'm doing and I do them written, and I have a second column, in that second column, I can write what the voices are inside of me in response to that affirmation. And that's really a potent exercise. And particularly if you use your non-dominant hand to write I call it the rebuttal, because that's what's going on inside of me. There's a rebuttal. And a lot of my rebuttals were around, you know, who do you think you are to think that you can have a good life? Who do you think you are to think that you can have what you want? You know, so here I would be affirming all these things, and then I would have this inner self. You know, some people could call it a critical parent, and we have lots of different names for what it is. Lisa, recently we did something with transactional analysis, so it could be that critical parent talking back to me. And usually the critical parent will tell me I haven't worked hard enough for something. So I don't really deserve it, because I have a really harsh, she doesn't talk so much anymore, but historically I had a really harsh inner critical parent who had a million rules that I could never meet up, you know, I could never live up to. But getting that dialogue going to find out really all the parts of yourself and what are they saying in response to what you're trying to manifest. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Value. Go back.
Can I ask you a question on that?
Always.
So, So going back to what gets in the way of manifesting your prayers and whatnot, is that kind of inner critic. And so then that could be the critical parent.
Yep.
Do I then want to evoke the critical parent in a dialogue? If, like, I don't want to feed the wolf, you know what I mean? I don't want to, like, bring them out if they've been silent for a long time.
Well, if you believe that in fact they aren't involved in this dialogue, there's no point to look for them. But I would just question whether they are saying something and it's really subliminal, so you may not have actually heard them. One of the ones that's subtle is like, oh, so you think you can do that? You know, it doesn't even have to be really loud. So I would just check it out, and you want your adult to be able to talk to them. Because otherwise you'll get into that parent-child dialogue that's toxic. So you want the adult to be able to say, this is my life, this is my choice, this is what I'm doing, in a very matter-of-fact way.
Right.
Good question. Stay tuned. Let me know. All right, all that Seth, this is a huge concept in the Seth teaching. And I got to tell you, I was studying the Seth material for a lot of years before I actually saw this concept. And I was stunned when I found out it was in the early books, because I didn't think it was. I thought it was something was introduced later on. So this, you know, at least I know you're familiar with values exercises and purpose exercises in coaching.
Mm-hmm.
This actually is a larger concept, but it's the concept that's behind that. So it fits into the grace concept. You know, if we know that we're born with a secure sense that we fit perfectly in our environment, so that we're here because our soul chose to incarnate, you know, the much larger perspective. So we're born with a secure sense that we fit perfectly into our environment, with a desire to explore and expand and fulfill ourselves. This impetus toward value fulfillment, as Seth calls it, is a simple desire to improve the quality of whatever form of life we find ourselves at the center of, to enrich that life in whatever way we can through our own unique propensities, and in so doing, leave our mark. As we have seen, each of us has our own ideal psychological pattern, our own blueprint for growth that propels us forward to the greatest possible value fulfillment for ourselves, which at the same time leads to the enrichment of other life forms. So this is always a principle. There is nothing that's good for one that is not good for all. So value fulfillment for me has been surprisingly subtle. And I know, Meg, one of the things that you shared recently was about realizing that health is kind of central to your value fulfillment. And that's true for me too. You know, the physical well-being, because my creaturehood and really enjoying dwelling in my creaturehood, my physicality, my Taurus self, is central to value fulfillment for me. You know, I'm somebody who likes to dig in the dirt. I'm somebody who likes to walk on the earth. I'm somebody who likes to swim in the ocean. I mean, I like the physicality of it. So when I am not taking good care of my body, then I limit the vehicle that gives me value fulfillment. One of the things that I didn't consciously acknowledge for much of my life was how important beauty is to me. You know, once again, astrologically, I have a big conjunction in Libra in my chart, and my moon and my Neptune. And, you know, all my life, beauty has been very important to me. And I'm very affected by my physical surroundings. And, you know, for years I lived in hotels. I was on the road, and I was in airplanes and, you know, things like that. So it wasn't aesthetically pleasing. And then, you know, my apartment, I never really bothered to do much with because I was never home. So I didn't have kind of the rich environment that I have now. So recognizing that. You know, really finding the things that have deep resonance for us.
I
Thoughts?
can just say,
Yeah.
as a student, that was really a great exercise for me to go through the value fulfillment exercise and really be forced, you know, sort of force myself to pick out, you know, what was really the most important value of, you know, considering many of the values were important to me, but really being forced to pick out, you know, which were of paramount importance. And yeah, so it was a really good exercise as a student to go through that. Yeah.
So, you know, I'm thinking because Brene Brown had a lot of this work too, you know, and doing her Daring Greatly courses and all that. So it seems like that's been a conversation I've been in a lot over the past couple of years. And maybe that's why I'm beginning to see it more clearly. Just in this past 48 hours, I've been reading about the new monasticism. And for value fulfillment for me, the other key thing is spirituality. That I actually live in a world that spirit is central to my existence, so that I believe that the divine is in everything. And I have eyes that I see the divine in everything, or I look for it, which is my thing with beauty. Because one of the things Seth talks about is when a species loses value fulfillment, the species dies. You know, when an individual loses value fulfillment, the individual dies. So, you know, he writes very profoundly about this. So there have been times in my life that it was hard to stay alive because I was not strongly connected to value fulfillment. And today, the way I understand it, it really is life energy. It's, you know, that unique energy for me that is what sustains me. So now certain things don't become optional. You know, not being around beauty is not optional. Not having a life where spirituality is the main theme of my thoughts, actions, and interactions in a day. So, for example, the gratitude list practice is very important to me because, you know, every member of the circle will make some reference to the larger spiritual reality. So that gives me the sense I'm in a community. You know, this is almost a year now we've had the Wisdom School running. That's very important to my value fulfillment because it means there is spiritual community. So, you know, just really beginning to name what is, you know, the language I started coming up with for the last 10 years as part of my own process and my own aging, and I had a fair amount of illness, was juice. Certain things don't have enough juice in them for me. And what I really meant was life. They are not life fulfilling. And what I now would say is that from a value fulfillment standpoint, they were not sustaining me. And so I can only afford to do a certain number of things that don't feed me, or else I'll wind up badly depleted. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about value fulfillment. What's it bring up for you, Lisa?
It brings up that there's one on here that I'm like, I don't know whether it's actually a value or whether it's a life script that you know, I've been taught for such a young age that maybe no longer serving. You know what I mean? I have made lots of decisions, you know, based on money. I'm not a materialistic person. I'm not whatever, but it is very much driving I need to be independent. I need to be able to take care of me. I need to be able to survive. I need to be able to whatever. And it has actually, like, over the past, couple of months that I've been, looking at things, it's really at the core of a lot of decisions that I make. And I'm having a hard time making decisions. Won't say against that, but it not being number one, but it not being like, and so like, then I see it on here and I'm like, is it really my value, or is it something that, I've just kind of been following because, it's a racket that I've played since I was, 8 years old.
So I might just suggest one of the things from my own experience is that it could be a fear, and that, that whole survival thing, that it's not
Sure.
actually really about money at all. And if you were assured that your survival were always guaranteed, what role would money have in your thinking?
Sure.
To see, one of the ways that I worked with this spiritual practice for all these years was, one of the key things was money. But it was really about feeling safe. And because, I don't really know how much money I have from day to day, and I don't really pay attention, because I have had more than enough.
Sure.
So many years, I mean, hugely more than enough for so many years, that I feel safe. So then I realized that I never was interested in money. One of the reasons that I never had a big corporate life is because money wasn't a sufficient enough motivator.
Right.
Nor was ego, nor was status. When I would contrast, value fulfillment for me comes from being creative and adventuresome. And you ask me to trade money for being creative and adventuresome, money's never going to win.
Right.
If you ask me to trade creative and adventure for status and power are never going to win. So once I got over being afraid of, that bag lady, which I lived with for a lot of years, that insecure childhood that left me with a sense of, maybe I'm not going to be able to keep a roof over my head. Once I did enough of this spiritual work long enough to really trust. Remember, it said God is never too late. God always comes on time. I did that 13th hour prayer so many times. And there are now just so many instances in my life where I'm sure I absolutely could not cover the rent. I absolutely could not, pay whatever I had to pay for. And I just have, 50 years now that say, that's just a silly fear. And so, everything that feeds me, all the stuff that has juice in it, really has nothing to do with money. And the practice, and I probably said it to both of you, but it's worth saying again, is that there are two things in what I've learned. Is there are two things, and we connect them, but they shouldn't be connected. One is our right work. So we incarnated, this whole value fulfillment is also tied to our right work. So there are unique gifts, unique abilities that I have that make it possible for me to do a certain kind of work in the world. And you have unique abilities and you have your right work. So everybody has their right work. Well, then there's this other thing called abundance. And abundance is the unlimited source from which we all can draw on. And abundance is the ocean. And if I go to the ocean with a teacup, I know, Meg, you walk on the ocean all the time. If you go with a teacup, that's all the abundance you're going to have. In my case, I went with a teaspoon. And, so I took my little teaspoon to the big ocean, and that's all I thought I was worthy of, was a teaspoon. And, then my teaspoon became a teacup.
Right.
Well, the ocean is the ocean. It doesn't care if I come with a tanker and, fill up the tanker full of ocean, because it is unlimited. So, abundance, I do not really get paid for my right work. And this is how I've thought about it for 30 years. I suit up, I show up, and I meet what life puts in my life for today. And I'm doing all kinds of interesting things. And it doesn't matter whether it's a so-called paid for service or not, because that's just my right work. this wisdom school is my right work. You know, the mentoring and coaching I do is my right work. I work with, you know, dealerships. That's my right work. I get to have great conversations with people in all those locations. And then God supplies abundance that is only limited by my capacity to receive. You know, Denise and I had this conversation on our ride to work the other day, is, you know, I believe that if I could imagine, you know, and truly believe that I could wake up with the money under my pillow, you know, if tonight I went to sleep and said, okay, you know, I'd like 10 years worth of covering my living expenses under my pillow when I wake up tomorrow morning. Yeah, if I really could hold that consciousness,
Sure.
it would be there. It would be there. But, you know, that's not where I am, and I don't actually really feel like I need it because, you know, 10 years worth will show up in 10 years as it needs to, as it always has. So then really what I'm supposed to be focused on is my right work. And that's this part about value fulfillment is, you know, and that's the part we talked about in the chapter about impulses. So I listen for the impulses. So I just had another one of those weekends where, you know, I was doing one thing and then I read this article and that led to this other article that led to this whole body of work on the new monasticism that I didn't even know about. That's, you know, a spiritual path that I find very likely and interesting. And it's what people are doing to build spiritual community. So that's just me keeping my eyes open for my right work. And then I trust the abundance to be provided. Yeah, so disconnecting, we get paid for our right work is key. So I know, Lisa, in your case, you have a whole bunch of right work that's waiting for you. Yeah, and if you can just let go of the idea of how will I get paid for it, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I mean, you've been studying and training and learning and all this stuff, right?
Yes.
Okay, and the same is true for Meg. Meg has a whole bunch of stuff that she's been studying and training and learning that she has a lot of passion for. As soon as we have a lot of passion for it, as soon as we have the kind of passion that has us studying on our own, learning on our own, offering it to people wherever we are, explaining to people that their feet don't have to remain flat and that they should be able to move their toes. That's a conversation Lisa had with me, Meg, in October that started me on a whole new physical path. So that's our right work. So that's really what we're supposed to be focused on. And then we just do these affirmations about God and abundance, and it just shows up. Because that's the way the universe is. Is that at all believable to you?
Yes.
Do you believe that I believe?
I believe that you believe.
Okay,
And
then
it is believable.
it is believable, because if it has happened for one,
Yes.
it can happen for anyone. And there is nothing about you that would make it less likely to happen. There's nothing about Meg that would make it less likely to happen, because, you know, it's just a principle. It's true for everyone.
Fist bump, Meg.
Bump, bump.
Oh yeah, for sure.
All right, next slide. Oh, now I'm going to tell you about this book I've been reading because it has 3 great quotes. So this is The New Monk. So everybody knows what a monk is, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And there were women that were the same thing as people who choose a contemplative life. And in the Middle Ages, there were a lot of really famous women who were contemplative. St. Teresa of Avila, Julian of Norwich, Hildegard von Bingen, you know, just incredible women. If women went into the convent, they actually got a lot of freedom. So the intellectual women, that's where they went, because, and it's been true for a long time. It's where blue stockings. When I was growing up, that's Emily Dickinson and all the women that were out in by Mount Holyoke and Radcliffe, they were called blue stockings because they were spinsters and they were intellectuals. And so they got to have a life of the mind. And so that was, you know, rather than being married and, yeah. So when I was young, I knew, oh, that's what I wanted to be. So here's what it said about the monk. The monk, and this is where the quote came from the beginning, the monk is caught up not only with his own spiritual development, but with this mysterious completing of the world. So Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the brilliant evolutionary scientist and Catholic priest, captures this beautifully in his book, The Divine Milieu, where he speaks of the goal of human life. And so that's what we talked about is, you know, starting with the natural territory of his own self. So that's where we start. A work, an opus into which something enters from all the elements of the earth. So our air, fire, water, and I've left something out. Earth. Makes his own soul through all his earthly days. And at the same time, he collaborates in the world. So our right work is when we are in the world with this opus of completing the world. So if we imagine that each one of us is an actor in this wonderful opus, that if each one of us shows up to do our right work, then we complete the world. If we don't show up to do our right work, we cannot complete the world. So
somebody else is counting on you, Meg. The whole world is counting for you to show up and do your right work.
I'm feeling it. I'm feeling it these last few days. Yep.
Yep. So now this is something that I just love too, because it's about spiritual guidance. So another point of departure from the traditional role of monk comes in the area of spiritual direction. More often than not, the new monastic is not drawn to the traditional ideas of obedience to a superior or complete dedication to a guru. This is something I've wrestled with for a long time because, you know, I just never really could do that. While respecting traditional roles and many of the successes they have borne, the new monastic finds spiritual direction most often in the depths of spiritual friendship. The new monastic recognizes beyond any doubt the necessity of elders, the need for spiritual direction, and the great gift afforded to him by those who advance further along than he. So having been in 12-step program for 40 years, we have something called sponsor. And sponsor is somebody that gives spiritual guidance, who's further along than me. He struggles to develop a sense of discernment, and his spiritual mentors are indispensable to him. My sponsors have been indispensable to me. He sees this spiritual direction as the most profound blossoming of friendship. And I always say sponsorship is the most intimate relationship any of us will ever really know. And friendship becomes the keynote of the new relationship between the mentor and the mentee, between the teacher and the student. One is reminded of the apocryphal story of Buddha and his beloved attendant, Ananda. Ananda asks, "Dear Buddha, is spiritual friendship half of the journey to enlightenment?" And Buddha, with a grand smile, says, "No, Ananda, it is the whole of the journey." So I love that because the richness of my life in this whole area of spiritual mentorship and friendship, just so rich. So you know, I think some of us have been attracted to doing this coaching because of that. And I realized I probably won't ever be a coach in the definition of the coach training because I had too much training in the role of sponsorship. And sponsorship is actually a form of guidance, but it's done from an equal position. It's not done from a one up, one down. And that is just sweet. And then my favorite, spiritual community. And Lisa, I just remember what a strong statement you made about continuing the community when we were down in, you know, I mean, you cracked my heart wide open with your plea for that, you know, because it resonated so deeply. But there was no way you know, even though I was being pissy and withdrawn and I wasn't sure I wanted to participate, when you said that, I could not respond. It's like, yes. And because I agreed, I would be heartbroken if that happened. So yeah. The notion of spiritual friendship helps the new monk to realize the importance of human communities. He or she is interested in building communities that are sustainable, infused with a sense of the sacred, and that support their members to discover and live out their sacred vocation in the world. Their care extends not only to others, but to the natural world around them and to all living creatures. The key point may be summarized as the new monastic does not see a split between their inner and outer lives. This has probably been my greatest goal, is to keep merging them so that my work in the world, I show up more and more as who I am in my work every day. And the new monk is in the world but not of it, as Jesus taught us to be. He playfully plays the game of life in the world, but does not abide by the rules. And playing changes some of the rules at the risk of his life, obviously. For by changing the rules, he will eventually change the game. So I'll tell you one little story about that. Last week, I'm working with a client, on-site a company that's really messed up. And, they've got all kinds of drama and damage and chaos and fear and worry. And, it's a business that was bought 3 years ago, and they've been through a lot of managers and a lot of upheaval. And a lot of people have been there most of their lives. So it's very distressing to them. And people are afraid. So I went through, I'm usually there for 12 hours, and I'm in conversation for every minute of the 12 hours. People are in so much pain. And I feel like I'm actually in kind of a disaster relief situation. It's so intense. And one of my last conversations was with a man that I'd had previous conversations with him. And everybody is so fearful that they are working 12 and 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they're exhausted. But they can't stop working. And I know this mode because they're afraid if they don't do enough, so they never, it's the Brene Brown, I'm not enough. I'm not doing enough. I don't have enough. So that they're working themselves into exhaustion. So this man is living in a hotel because he's been brought in for this job as a sales manager. His family is in upstate New York, so he's away from his family. He's working these very long hours, and he's exhausted. He's actually a Pentecostal pastor. So we had that conversation before, and he's African-American, grew up in London. And, I asked him if his mother wore, elaborate hats to church, because I know Black women do. And he said, oh, yes. And we had a great conversation about that. So I had a coaching conversation with him, which is what I was supposed to do. And then I suggested to him, I said, so I'm going to give you an assignment. And your assignment is to stay no later than 9 p.m. and to go back to your hotel room and take out your Bible and read some scripture. And then you are to pray and meditate and go to sleep. I'm there on a contract with Ford Motor Company. This is not in my contract. Matter of fact, there's a part of me that it would be afraid in the past that I'd get fired for doing this, but it was absolutely what was needed. And so at the end of this coaching conversation, he said, would it be all right if we prayed? So he wanted to pray. And he did a wonderful Pentecostal prayer to, our Father and Daddy, and, provide for us. And, he prayed that I would be safe all the way home on my drive, and that the wings of the angels would carry me and all that. And we had a wonderful prayer session. And in that moment, as that all wrapped up, and then I went on to have my final session with the general manager, which was also intense. And I gave him the same affirmations that I sent you, which is way outside of anything I would have done in the past. But it's me showing up fully and responding to the need, and not having a split between my professional self and the self that lives in the world. So it was another man who's not sleeping at night because he's so anxious. It's another man who's trying through sheer will to make something happen, and everybody is hating him. And he's hating himself, and he's not sleeping, and really, and he's 55, he could have a heart attack. So the same thing. And he had started a Bible study with this other pastor. They're good friends. So I had had the invitation to have the conversation. And I decided to move in because at this point in my life, this is value fulfillment for me. This is me showing up fully. So, and letting go of the idea of abundance. If I trust that God is my employer, not Ford, and that, when I suit up and show up every day, I'm accountable to that divine source that I say, you know, show me what you want me to do today and help me have the strength to do it. You know, help me have the intuition to hear what's needed and then the strength to provide it. So that's kind of what I'm doing with this. Wild and wacky. All right, are we ready?
Sure. Yeah. That looks great.
Isn't that glorious?
Is that Mary Ellen's?
It is Mary Ellen's. So she's got her hummingbird down here at the bottom. She loves her hummingbirds. You know, it's down over here. And then, you know, I wish you were here to narrate it for us. She's got healthy eating, better life, better world. This is this whole art thing she's doing around Aspire. You know, she has built a business to do that. She hasn't quite launched her first event yet, but she's ready, and it's about play. And look at these wacky birds here, and you know, find your story. Just really, I look forward to hearing what she has to say about it. Your memory, your story. So it sounds like, you know, the Brene Brown thing around owning our own story. Yep. And I thought Jennifer was going to be on the call. She said she was going to be. This is hers. And we all know that she's looking to live on the beach. And, you know, I look forward to her telling us the story, and then a whole bunch of friends. And other
That's us.
That's us. It sure is. Yeah. And other friends. So, yep. And this is Meg. You want to tell your story about yours, seeing as we have somebody here to narrate?
Oh, sure. Well, I can just tell you, as a student of the Wisdom School, I have such enthusiasm for this project. I saw someone else's vision board and segments, and my application is astrology, so I had this inspiration. It means a lot to me. It's in an order that has to do with my natal chart, house placement, and so as Pamela knows, equanimity is really important to me. It's in the center, and I put Kuan Yin, the image of Kuan Yin, and mindful self-compassion down, you know.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah, in my inner self, in my fourth house of my inner life. And then my seventh house is really full of, you know, with Mark and the image of manifestation that I wanted. And just prosperity's there in the corner, but health, I don't know if I can narrate this, but, you know, just the asanas, the yoga postures that represent that to me, and then play and fun and humor with the girl on the swing, and there's a picture of my niece and nephew laughing, and
yep.
It was just a great, and community. You just mentioned community, and the hands, it'd be my 11th house. I see that as with the hands, and I think the quote is, it's by William Butler Yeats. Is that who it is? That there are no strangers, just friends you haven't met yet. And yeah, and just the words that came from sort of the value fulfillment and thinking about what was really important to me. So it was really, there was so much energy I could just share from this assignment and the sense of community the school gave me in creating this. So thank you.
Yeah, and it's really rich. And one of the things we talked about is a lot of the things that you have in your vision were intangible. So I think this is really great that you came up with images to make them a little more.
Yeah. I was thinking more like states of being, because I wasn't so fearful and concerned about this material plane so much as just states of being. Yeah.
So you have Betty Boop up there, I think, or who's the?
Yeah, that's a very whimsical postcard. Florida. I'd love to take a vacation. That's sort of material. I'd like to take a vacation to Florida someday. So that's particular mundane, and but also that's a nice pipe dream for me. That's something I don't. Maybe I have the resources, like you said, possibly to take a vacation. I haven't given myself permission to really
Right.
happen some winter, maybe next winter, 2018.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all possible.
Yeah, thanks.
So here's mine.
Nice.
I did mine as a mind map because that's how I think. Lisa, I've also been doing a lot of stuff on strategy execution for my clients, and there's a bunch of stuff that I was going to send you from these Europeans, and I'll probably do it, but yeah, because that's your field. So I realized that the three things that are up for me right now are the platonic ideals of the good, the true, and the beautiful. That at this stage in my life, which is my third Saturn cycle, what's really up for me is a life that is built on these three virtues, actually. So the good is considered the moral or ethical. So for that, I said what belongs there is spiritual community, spiritual practice, work in the world, and service groups. So that's like AA, ACA. And then the true they usually say is science, spiritual studies, development, and wellness. And then the beautiful is my garden, my studio, and my home environment. So I might get some pictures to go with it, but what I really wanted to do was capture the areas of my life that are important to me. And, you know, I think I've taken a lot of pretty pictures that I might be able to put in there. Yeah.
That's great. Is it the good, the true, the beautiful? Is that a Greek word called phronesis?
Say again?
Phronesis? That you can't really have the true and the truth without the good and the beautiful, like based on
Yes, that is the principle. The principle is I'm not sure the word. The most recent source of this is Ken Wilber's work, but that the three come together, and that the good life is these three things. And so what they aspired to in the good life was this, and it was more about the ideals rather than the whole principle about the third Saturn cycle is it's when we are meant to move into a higher expression of energy, less personal, more impersonal. And so you know, I finished the big cycle in the middle, which would have had a lot of stuff in it, and now it's moving into this cycle. In other cultures, people actually retreat from the world at this age. You know, we're going to live, people are going to have a fourth Saturn cycle, and I don't know what we know about that. But if you look at it, because, you know, 59 plus 28 is what? I think my dad is already in his fourth Saturn cycle.
Yeah.
What?
I don't know. I used to be able to do math in my head. 59 plus 28 is 87. I was right.
87. So yeah, my dad's already in his fourth Saturn cycle, and we don't even know what the fourth Saturn cycle is.
Well, you know, why don't you just come up with it?
I will have to, because, you know, I'll probably live that too. So I got to chart my own map for that. But I think it will. So I think I'm already in it, because I think it's this new monastic tradition and all those other things. A lot of the work I'm reading is about all these developmental stages, and, you know, where do we go? You know, because there's got to be continue evolution. So, because otherwise you get to a place of emptiness. So and then it becomes well, is this all there is? And that sense of, well, what will make life worth living? So.
Right. Pamela, she charts her own path.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, we just lost Megan. I don't think that was intentional.
I don't either.
Yeah, because she would have said goodbye. So maybe she'll come back on. Well, Jennifer didn't show up, and a lot of other people I thought were coming didn't show up, but we had a great time, as usual.
We sure did.
Yeah.
I was totally missing you guys because I missed last month.
I
I was
know.
on vacation, and
Your presence was definitely, your absence was noted.
thank you.
Yeah. Well, any other questions that are up for you? I know that I need to organize those links so you can find the astrology, and that is on my to-do. I got caught up in that book today. There went the day.
Sometimes it happens.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And what are you doing? Are you still working at the college?
Yeah. So hey, if you want to talk, do you want to stop recording?
I
So
do.
that we-
I do. Yeah, let's do that. Let me just figure out how to do it. Okay, I can pause share.
Bye, everyone.
Stop share. Stop share. And now I just got to stop recording. Stop recording.